Welcome to the IGEOS Show, where we help grow the passion for an extraordinary workplace. If you're listening to or watching this, we hope to strengthen your passion for a workplace that has the potential not only to have an extraordinary impact on your life, but also on the world. My name is Amit Riker, and my co-hosts are Valerio Pascotto and Timothy Galway. Now to you, Valerio.
Thank you, Amit. What drives our efforts is really a vision and credo to enrich humaneness in the workplace. For that, we interview thought leaders who have been inspired by values of compassion, empathy, and modeling to share their discoveries, challenges, and successes. Really, there is no time like now to change the tide, from hateful divisiveness to seeking similarities, from the myth of the genius to the wisdom of humankind, and from the fears of the primitive brain to the wonder of generosity and warmth.
To support you in this work of creating extraordinary workplaces, we would like to offer you a free worksheet you can download on the 5 disciplines of a high-performance team. Just go to IGEOS.net to download the sheet and learn more about us. And now, on to our guest for today. Welcome, conscious leaders, conscious teams. My name is Amit Riker, and I have with me my co-host, Valerio Pascotto, and this is the IGEOS Show. We have an amazing guest with us today, Safi Bahcall, and I'm going to introduce him with a little bio, and then we're going to dive in and have a phenomenal conversation today. So, Safi is a second-generation physicist, the son of 2 astrophysicists, and a biotech entrepreneur. He received his BA summa cum laude from Harvard and his PhD in physics from Stanford, where he worked with Lenny Susskind in particle physics, the science of the small, and the Nobel laureate Bob Laughlin in condensed matter physics, the science of the many. After working for 3 years as a consultant for McKinsey, Safi co-founded a biotechnology company developing new drugs for cancer. He led its IPO and served as its CEO for 13 years. In 2008, he was named Ernst & Young New England Biotechnology Entrepreneur of the Year. And then in 2011, he worked with President Obama's Council of Science Advisors on the future of national research. He is most recently the author of the Wall Street Journal bestseller, Loonshots: How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries. And so we're gonna get a chance to dig into that in his fascinating ideas and book. And just to give you a sense of the accolades that it's been getting, you know, the book was selected by Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Daniel Pink, and Susan Cain for the Next Big Idea Club, as well as has been selected by the Washington Post as 10 leadership books to watch for in 2019, on Inc.'s top 10 business books you need to read in 2019, and much more. So there's so much more that I could keep saying about that, Safi, but would love to dig in. And welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Delighted to be on your show.
Absolutely. So there's a number of different ways I enjoy diving into these types of conversations, but let's get a glimpse for the audience. What got you on this crazy path to writing this really fascinating book?
Well, about 18 years ago, and as you mentioned, I'd started off in the academic world, and then I worked for a few years in McKinsey. But about 18 years ago, I started a biotech company specializing in new drugs for cancer. And not long after I started that company, my father was diagnosed with a rare type of leukemia. And I figured, well, now I'm an insider, I can do something about this. But unfortunately, nothing I could do made any difference. And he died not long after. And then over the years, as our company grew and we went public, everywhere I looked inside, big companies, small companies, trapped in the basements of those organizations were ideas, promising ideas that could have helped my father. Not because any of the people are bad people. Everybody wants to go home and say how they're making a difference, but because of something strange that happens when people come together into a group. Just this kind of weird thing, that weird mystery that good teams with the best intentions and excellent people will kill great ideas. Good teams will kill great ideas. And I wanted to do something about answering that question and liberating all those promising ideas that are trapped inside the basements of small and large companies everywhere. So that's why I wrote this book.
Amazing. I had the fortune of meeting you. Actually, my friend Rio, a mutual colleague and friend, she had invited me, and so I really found it fascinating. The sort of outline or the means of a mix between physics, science, history, psychology, and a whole mix of things. And so as you started to dig into, I guess, the research behind it, and what sort of got you started? You gave the background, but what were some of the initial starting points that got you writing the book and deciding to sort of integrate all these fascinating different fields?
Well, I was a full-time CEO for 13 years, I guess the last 7 or so years, as we were a public company. And so I didn't really have time. I was giving sort of fun, every now and then I'd go to one of these gatherings and they say, hey, talk about, everybody talk about something that's kind of not your work. And so I would talk about history of science, history of physics, area that I knew. And I also would talk about I'd start with the birth of modern science. And I got very curious the more I read and tried to discuss the history and explain it kind of in a fun way. And I think I called it like 3,000 years of physics in 45 minutes, like the 8 biggest ideas. But the more I would give that sort of fun talk, which was kind of a hobby, the more I had trouble understanding why modern science began in Western Europe, in kind of 17th century Western Europe. Why there, of all places, when those were tiny little kind of backwater countries, pretty irrelevant on the global scale for not just for that period, but for about 1,000 years. China, Islam, and India had dominated the world. China and India together had half the world's GDP. Beijing was 1 million people for, when London was maybe 50,000 people. And they dominated early science, early technology, organization. The leading scholars in the world for 700 years was kind of the Islamic scholars and Islamic madrasas, and paper printing, gunpowder, canal locks, advanced drilling, mining, irrigation, all were developed in China 1,000 years before the first university even opened its door in Western Europe. And the astronomy and mathematics used to make much of the progress in Western Europe in sort of 17th century, Copernicus, Kepler, Newton. It's probably getting a little more detailed than you wanted, but this is just sort of fun. And since we're just chatting, so much of that, early astronomy and mathematics came from India and Islamic astronomers. Copernicus was really kind of the last of as one of the great historians said, one of the last in the line of the great Islamic astronomers. And I kept wondering why. It just was such a strange thing. Why Western Europe when it was these tiny little countries? And China, Islam, and India were so dominant and were so far more advanced than anything in Western Europe. And I kind of puzzled on that, and it was just sort of a little hobby. And I was just curious. I didn't have a good answer to it until about 2011, I was asked to work with President Obama's Council of Science Advisors on a project on the future of national research. And it was the first day, the chairman of our group, stood up and said, there were 5 of us who were kind of selected around the country to work on this recommendation for President Obama on how we should shape the architecture of national research in the United States for the next 50 years. And he said, your job is to write the next generation of the Vannevar Bush report. And at the time, I had I was busy, I was running a company, and this was sort of a little side project. I wasn't really a professional historian or science policy guy, so I had no idea who Vannevar Bush was or what his report was. And I remember wondering in my head, like, how do I get out of this project? I have no idea what these people are talking about. And but then it became much more interesting. I was sort of forced to go back and understand some of the history. If we were going to think about the future, I needed to understand some of the past. And I discovered that Vannevar Bush was a guy who in the 1920s and 30s had been dean of engineering at MIT, an incredible inventor. And during World War II, he came up with a new system for innovating astonishingly fast that mobilized the nation's scientists for war and created all these new technologies that essentially turned the course of World War II, because we started off far behind Nazi Germany. And then the system and the ideas that he developed, I realized why they were, how they worked and why they work and why he did what he did, helped address this other thing that I just kept wondering about. Why did modern science begin in Western Europe? And I realized the two of them had a strong overlap. And it was connected to the stuff I'd been thinking about why did world history develop in this way with these giant majors, China, Islam, and India, that were incredibly good at giant infrastructure projects, drilling, mining, the Great Wall, the Taj Mahal, the Grand Canal, that Europe had nothing like that at all. But they were not very good at these loonshots, these small, crazy ideas that could change the world. And it was the same in my industry in drug discovery. Merck, Pfizer, and Novartis, very good at the giant franchises, the next statin drug, the next ulcer drug, but not very good at the small, crazy ideas that can actually transform an industry. Microsoft at the time was, this dominant franchise was Windows, but they missed this little crazy thing called mobile, and got almost wiped off the planet because of that. And search and all those other things. And so I realized that they were connected. The film industry also, majors, Columbia, Universal, Paramount, very good at franchises, the next Avengers, the next James Bond, but they kept missing these crazy little things like, how about turtles that are really big and have swords and like to eat pizza? Oh, that's ridiculous. Well, of course, that became Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a multi-billion-dollar franchise. So I ended up realizing that there was a connection, why these industries separated, why China, Islam, and India were like the Merck, Pfizer, and Novartis of their day, were like the Columbia, Universal, Paramount of the day. They were the big major franchises, good at the next, the 27th James Bond movie, giant walls, giant buildings. But they weren't good at nurturing these small ideas that are easily written off as crazy, like, the Earth goes around the sun, not the other way around. That appeared with a little, Catholic bishop in Northwest Poland in 1510, or the idea that the combustion properties of gases all just sounded irrelevant. They were presented with those ideas and dismissed them. And those ideas, of course, led to the scientific revolution, which led to the combustion property of gases and using that to generate power, which freed human species from muscle power, muscle of humans, muscle of animals, to grow exponentially in what we could produce, which industrialized these tiny little nations that were, they weren't even 0.5% of GDP, your average one of them. And if, China and India were 50%. And boom, they used that to take over the world, to defeat these much larger empires. And I realized that story, which is kind of where I began, helped address some of these business questions. Why very large companies neglect these loonshots in their basement, just like China and India had neglected, and Islam had neglected these crazy ideas that could become modern science and help them industrialize. And that they were connected, and the system that Bush invented in World War II was a new way that large companies could harness that power and unlock those ideas. It was a way for the United States and the United States military specifically to tap into the power of these crazy ideas. And as it turned out, a couple of those ideas, most importantly, microwave radar and long-range radio navigation, were decisive in turning the course of the war. So that's a probably much longer question than you were hoping for. I usually don't go into that much detail, but I figured, why not?
No, I love it.
Fascinating.
Love the context.
And by the way, I should say I did start from. Usually, I have a much shorter answer, which press people like, and reporters like. When you have 5 seconds on radio, you have to give the much shorter answer. But that is really where I started, with China, Islam, and India, and the birth of modern science. And so then I remember when I wrote it up, I'd written some kind of essay, and this book agent found it and said, "Oh, this is really a lot of stuff. It's too much for an essay. You really should be writing a book." I don't know if okay. And then I wrote it. And then when I wrote it, and the publishers was like, and I then extended it to the business world and companies and teams, and how teams can use these ideas, and where Vannevar Bush got his ideas, which really was from the business world, from a guy named Theodore Vail, who created Bell Labs and figured out how large companies could innovate. And of course, AT&T and Bell Labs created the transistor and the CCD chip, and so much of the vacuum tube, and so much that gave birth to the electronic age. And it was America's largest company. And so I called those in the end the Bush-Vail rules. And anyway, so when I wrote the book, I had started from this kind of birth of modern science thing, which I just found fascinating, because it's very different than what you grow up here. I grew up in New Jersey, and you grow up in the States, you sort of more or less, the world got modern because there was the Greeks, then nothing, then Newton, then boom, a 30-second summary. And that's just so far from what actually happened. So I found that fascinating. Publishers didn't find it quite so fascinating. Publishers were like, this business stuff and how it applies to teams, and the rise and fall of Pan Am, and the history of the James Bond movies, and Pixar, and Steve Jobs, and the rise and fall of Edmund Land, and what really happened with Polaroid and the spy satellites. That's awesome. That 17th century history, could you put that in the back maybe? They kept pushing and pushing until it finally fell out of the book. And then only at the end, when we sort of had some time between some iterations, I kind of brought it back as like a final chapter. And by then they were like, the rest of the book was good. And they were like, okay, that's fine. So that is a very much longer answer than I usually give to where all this stuff came from, but it was sort of a circuitous route.
Very fascinating. Very fascinating. Thank you, Safi, for sharing. I had a question. In the positive, what would you say is the mindset that can capture these extraordinary leaps of innovation and creativity? If you're thinking of it in the positive, what could I do to facilitate capturing and not falling into that trap?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I have there's sort of a handful of kind of rule. If I'm thinking about lessons for individuals as well as lessons for companies. So for individuals, there's a handful of them. One of them I like to think of as, and I'll give you 4. So the first one is, and I got these mostly from spending a lot of time working with either great scientists or great entrepreneurs, innovators, and they have these kind of characteristics. And first one I think of as LSC. And by that, I mean, listen to the suck with curiosity. And I say that because anytime if you're an entrepreneur or you're an innovator, you're trying to pursue some new idea, it will, and if it's important, it would almost always fail the first few times. If it doesn't fail the first few times, it's probably actually not important. The fact that it's failing, the big breakthroughs generally fail several times because otherwise somebody else would have done it. Most people give up at those breakthroughs. So what you want to do, though, is what I've seen the best innovators do is listen to those negative outcomes, whether it's, and that's very difficult, because if you're pursuing something that you're putting your heart and soul into, and let's say an investor walks away, or a strategic partner pulls out, or a customer doesn't like your thing and switches, the natural reaction is to just want to dismiss them. Say, oh, they're idiots, they don't understand, and I have this great thing, and they're just not paying attention, and or whatever excuse it is, because you're anxious and you want some reassurance. You want to turn to your friends and mentors or mother and say, I'm on the right track, right? Yes, honey, you are. What the really great entrepreneurs do is they don't just listen to that suck and acknowledge it. That's sort of all the feedback of active listening, repeat what you heard. That's not actually enough. What you really want to do is take off that defensiveness hat and pull on that thread of, could you help me understand what it is that, wasn't working for you? And most people don't want to tell you that. They're taking time out of their day. They have other things they need to get done. It could be a difficult conversation. It could hurt a friendship and they want to keep the friendship for the future. Maybe some other thing, like you're a venture capitalist, you don't give straight. People say, that was fantastic. Our fund just closed though, and we have some whatever conflict. Love the idea. Come back with your next one though. They want to actually tell you that was really stupid and you sounded like a moron when you presented and your slides were all out of whack. Why would they tell you that? Then you might hate them and not come back with your next idea, which might actually be a good one. You might have figured it out. So they want somebody else to tell you, not them. So the really great entrepreneurs or scientists learn to listen to the suck with curiosity. I mean, take off that defensiveness hat, put on the Sherlock Holmes hat. And by that, I mean, you start to probe. Use all the tools at your availability to say, I know this would be, not awkward and asking a lot, but if you had just 2 minutes, could you give me like one piece of feedback, what I should do differently? Or what made you not want to buy, or what made you walk away or choose somebody else? That's where if you pull on that, that's where you get that tiny little nugget of gold. You might find, for example, some guy said, eventually you ask him, he coughs it up. Well, there's this competitor in France who's got this other thing and they've got this other feature. It's just really useful for us. And their price is low. And you'd never heard of them. And you're like, wait, what other feature? Hang on, we could do that. And it's easy. And you take a look, we could actually do it better. And it actually fits in better with our thing than it does with their thing. And we'd be here. And like, only by listening to that suck with curiosity, not defensiveness, trying to convince them to buy. But what you're really trying to do is get that gold of why. Why not? Because that is the gold that you can use to improve. And generally, very often they know something you don't. And your goal is to get to that something because they don't want to give it to you for all the reasons we just mentioned. So the great entrepreneurs, innovators, scientists, and so that experiment fails in a lab, someone tried to reproduce your results, didn't work. Instead of saying they're idiots and they can't figure it out, you call them up and say, walk me through what the steps that you did, because maybe there's something they're doing that other people are doing that you don't understand, which is causing it to fail in those labs and you're not even hearing about it. But if you can get it out of them, be nice enough to get them to spend the time and give you that feedback, you can fix it. And then that's a goal. So LSC is listen to the suck with curiosity. That's one. There's a bunch of others, but depends how much time you have.
You promised 4, so.
I did promise 4, didn't I? I'm going to come to regret that.
Give us just one more. All
right. Well, another one is mind the false fail. So here's what I mean by that. And by false fail, I mean when something stumbles, you want to really dig and figure out, is it a flaw in the idea, fundamental flaw in the idea, or is it a flaw in the experiment? And so here's what I mean by that. I'll give you an example. When I'll give you one technical one, older, and one modern. Technical one, when a scientist in Japan that I kind of write about on Loonshots made the first breakthrough for what became the statin drugs, which is a cholesterol-lowering Lipitor, probably one of the biggest breakthroughs in heart disease in the last 50 years. It's probably prevented tens of millions of heart attacks, saved millions of lives in the last 40 years. I think there's 30 or 40 million Americans take them. $1/3 trillion in sales. And so this relatively young guy at the time, a scientist in Japan, came up with this pretty brilliant idea for how you could identify and create a drug to lower cholesterol. And he'd worked hard, and people were very skeptical at the time. He says, well, cholesterol's everywhere in your body. If you take that, shouldn't you just destroy the body? And he had some reasons for thinking not, but he did the first experiment, and it was in mice. And he tried his drug in mice, and he was very excited because he'd seen, the basic stuff in a plastic dish work out. Then he gives it to this first animal model in a mouse study. Nothing. Absolutely fails. Company's ready to shut down, like most companies do. Okay, well, you tried your first model and done. But then he had an idea. He was actually out drinking a few nights later at a bar near his lab, and ran into a buddy who did experiments with chickens down the hall, and said, wait a minute, I want, chickens lay eggs, and eggs have a lot of cholesterol, so they must have a very high base level. Maybe mice, since they don't lay eggs or anything, maybe they just have a low level. So whether it's working or not, I just can't see it. Maybe there's a species problem, not a drug problem. Gave it to chickens, and boom, spectacular data, went into the clinic, long story. There are actually several more failures, several more false failures, which, we don't have time to now. But the bottom line of that story is that failure in a mouse model was a false fail. And that, the 10 or so companies that were working on it and gave up, they lost $1/3 trillion had they just persisted a little bit longer and asked, was this really a flaw in the drug or a flaw in the experiment? So that's a science one. There's the one I find kind of fun is the Facebook one, the false fail of Friendster. So when Mark Zuckerberg was going around in 2004 looking for money for his new startup called The Facebook at the time, social networks, you may remember, was kind of a fad. There was Friendster and MySpace and dozens at the time, and none of them did very well. People started on one and then moved and started and moved. And at the time, people were on Friendster, and it was just starting to tank, and people were jumping to MySpace right around that time. So most investors said, well, it's just like a clothing fad. People wear one social network one season, then they switch to the next one. Not a good business model. Won't ever make any money. And there was a guy out of Stanford who said, I wonder if that's really true. I wonder, because he had some friends at Friendster, and said, I kind of know that the Friendster website is crashing. So let me get the retention data. So he got the user retention data on Friendster and found that the data showed that users were staying on the site for hours, despite the fact that the website was really irritating. And he said, even though it's an incredibly irritating site, people are staying. He said, I don't think this is a bad business if customers are ignoring a bad website. They're leaving because of a software bug. It's just become too bad. As they've grown, the website has become intolerable, and they're going to a different one. So his name was Peter Thiel, and he gave Zuckerberg $500,000, and he sold it 8 years later for $1 billion. And so what Peter had learned was how to mine the false fail.
Wonderful story.
Wow, Safi, there's so many rich stories. I mean, you're just scratching the surface here with a couple of examples you're providing, and there's so many more in the book itself. And with our time slowly winding down, maybe a question to sort of integrate. You talk about the 4 rules for sort of nurturing Loonshots, and everyone listening or watching, definitely go check out the book, get the book, and then see the principles dug in even more. But the 4th one, you talk about creating a critical mass. And so a lot of our audience members are thinking about, how can we, conscious capitalism, B Corps, how can we be helping to make an impact in the world, or really be using business or whatnot as a force for good. So what thoughts would you share from your research or around this topic of what's involved with creating a critical mass to help move an idea forward?
Well, I every now and then, I talk to a lot of companies. I talk to a lot of national security and military agencies. They all want to understand how to balance the core and the new. If you have some core thing going on, project that's working pretty well, how do you become the initiator and not the victim of innovative surprise? So how do you grow what you're saying? How do you encourage these early stage ideas without dropping the ball on kind of the core thing that you're doing? And another one that I've, in addition to military or security agencies or large companies, I've also been asked by cities who want to turn things around. And that's where the question of critical mass really comes in. Because, as an example, I don't know how many cities in the United States say, we want to be a biotech hub, let's do that. Well, here's the problem. You can't really have 5,000 biotech hubs. You could have 1 or 2 or 3 that make sense. What you need, the reason that you want, and the reason is critical mass, because if you just have 1 or 2 or 3, a small straggler, a small number of new projects or new ideas in a particular sector, let's say you're a B Corp or you're trying to, I've talked with some nonprofits, let's say climate change, you're trying to encourage some global impact, local global impact. If you just nurture 1 or 2 ideas, you don't have enough critical mass to create this virtuous cycle of enough there for investors to want to come put in money, because if one thing fails, it'll go into the next, it'll go into the third. If there's just one, it's a very big binary risk. You also don't create enough critical mass for people to want to come and join, because if there's just 1 or 2 companies, then if one is out, then they're out of a job and there's nobody nearby for them to move over. The reason, let's say, Boston became a biotech hub or San Francisco is because there's a couple hundred small companies. So investors can locate here and start putting money around. And if one fails, that's okay, because there's others nearby. Employees will move from Detroit or Topeka, Kansas to Boston because they'll take a job at one risky startup. They wouldn't have joined that company if it was in Detroit or Topeka, because if it goes under, where do they go next? So investors want a bunch of them together, employees to attract good people, and vendors, suppliers. It makes sense for people who create the infrastructure for these little companies to locate where that critical mass is, and then they can offer low prices because they have many customers. If you're in Topeka, the prices are going to be high because there's only 1 or 2 examples. So critical mass helps attract funding, helps attract people, helps attract suppliers, and then it feeds off, the ecosystem feeds off itself because the good practices spread and people meet. And so you want, the lesson or the moral, or certainly for like in for-profit companies who want to create an innovation lab or whatever, if 1 out of 10 ideas fail, it turns out statistically you need 24 to get a 90% chance that one of them is going to work. And so you actually want to nurture, you can, if you want, let's say, a 90% chance of success on something that has a pretty low probability, as most early stage projects do, you really want to think about getting up to close to 24 projects before you get critical mass. And so if you're a nonprofit, if you're a B Corp, which is got social good as an objective, you want to sort of ignore the idea, if you can, to the extent that you can, of just placing all your eggs in one basket, because you don't get any of that virtuous cycle benefits. Almost nothing works right the first time, and then you're dead in the water when it doesn't. So that's what it means to translate critical mass from cities or companies into sort of the B Corp or nonprofit sector.
Wonderful. Thank you, Safi. Valerio, anything else before we wrap up here?
I've left you guys speechless.
I know.
Probably
no. Inspired.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Definitely inspired.
Okay.
The speechless comes from inspired. Thank you, Safi. It was an honor to have you and to listen to what could make a significant difference for our children's children.
Oh, thanks for saying that. That makes me feel good, and that would make all of this stuff that I do and we do rewarding.
Absolutely. What it reminds me of so many other, the last thing that you mentioned reminds me of some of Adam Grant's work of, getting more ideas out there so that some critical mass can really catch and whatnot. And I'd love to be able to find some other time to just chat and go into this further. But since we don't have indefinite time, where can people find more about you, Safi? There's obviously people can go get the book, Loonshots, but where else can people find out more about the work you're doing?
I try to keep my website pretty updated, loonshots.com. I do actually post to LinkedIn pretty often, a little bit to Twitter. And my handle there is just my name, Safi Bahcall. So people can find me there.
Wonderful. We'll be sure to include those links and resources when we post this episode. So thank you so much, Safi, for joining us. Thank you to our audience and listeners and viewers. This is Amit Riker and Valerio Pascotto with the IGEOS Show. Until next time, we'll continue to bring thought leaders, industry leaders who are not only making an extraordinary impact in the workplace, but also the world. Until next time, cheers.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for joining us today. We have many more exciting thought leaders to come on this show. If you enjoyed this interview, please click the like button and also subscribe so that you can stay tuned to learn from other powerful thought leaders in future shows. We would also appreciate your comments and feedback on the show, as well as who else you would like to hear from. And don't forget to visit our site, IGEOS.net, to download the free worksheet on the 5 disciplines of a high-performance team. See you next time.